Today we have a very special guest. I should tell you that I introduced myself as a motorman Elwin, former operator, motorman on the Interurban, which went from Vancouver all the way to Steveston. I say former because the Interurbans no longer are around. What happened? And how is it that they are somewhat extinct today? Well, you can thank the car for that. And speaking of cars, we have a car expert, Mr. Nigel Mathews, contributor to the Vancouver Province, international car judge, and many other things. So, welcome, Nigel. How are you?
Thank you very much. Wonderful to be here.
So let's go back a little bit. I want to get this out of the way. Mm-hmm. I got to find out what is that accent that you have.
I'm originally from England. I grew up near Oxford, or actually very close to Abingdon, where the MG factory is. I came to Canada in 1975 when I was about 21 years of age. Young and traveling, and I only intended to stay here for a couple of years at most. And
you decided to stay.
I fell in love with Vancouver, and here I am.
I thought you were going to say you fell in love with a certain person, perhaps.
Oh, yes. That didn't take very long, and before I knew it, I had the White House and the picket fence and the station wagon and the kids and the mortgage.
All right. So we have you here today to talk about cars. So let's start off with the very beginning. Who invented the first car? Was it Henry Ford, or was it the Carl Benz, or was it somebody else?
Yeah, Carl Benz probably could be credited with that, and that was in the towards the end of the 1800s. Prior to, of course, everybody's aware that prior to the car, there were, horse carriages. Yeah, and of course the car became known as the horseless carriage.
Exactly.
In between carriages and cars, motorcycles and bicycles played a big part. So a lot of bicycle manufacturers, probably prior to making bicycles, they were probably blacksmiths. They went from being a blacksmith to a bicycle manufacturer and ended up making cars.
That's quite the transition.
It is.
Or the metamorphosis.
Yes.
So you list for me, please, all the things that you do. I know you judge and you write columns on cars, new,
yep.
Old, and vintage.
Yes,
What else are you involved with?
Well, my day job. Put it that way.
All right.
My day job is I'm the marketing and sales director for Hagerty Canada. Hagerty is the world's largest classic car and boat insurer.
And they are only in Canada, U.S., or throughout
Canada,
the world?
the U.S., and England. We have quite a sizable portfolio. If everything that we insured, heaven forbid, went up in smoke this evening, we'd need to find $19 billion. So that's what I do on a daily basis. I've written a column in the province for probably the last 12 years. It's a once a week, 300 words. I tend to write about obscure vehicles. I like the oddball stuff.
Okay, that makes two of us then.
Yeah, and I occasionally get emails from readers who say, well, why do you write about this thing? Why don't you write about Corvettes and Mustangs? And my response to them is that, if they want to read about those, they can go and buy Road and Track.
So you want to do something different?
Yeah, I like the quirky stuff, and it's the research side of it gives me a great joy. And I really enjoy sharing that with other people.
This is a news report. Lockdale Locals. The new community hall opposite the post office is practically completed. A noticeable feature is the excellence of the floor, for which Mr. J.W. Allen is responsible. Mrs. Cave has sold her place on Cliff at Sherlock to people from South Vancouver. Mrs. Cave is remaining in the district. The Ladies' Aid held a meeting last Thursday at the home of President Mrs. J.W. Wright. It was arranged to hold a sale of work at an early date. The Young People's Club held its first meeting of the season recently. Miss Margaret Hartshorn was elected secretary. The CGIT held its first meeting of the season last Friday at the home of Mrs. West.
Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Banana.
Banana who?
Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Orange.
Orange who?
Orange, you glad I didn't say banana? I already know that one. Knock, knock.
Who's there? Which one are you doing?
Noah.
Noah who?
Noah, way to open the door. Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Spell.
Spell who?
Okay. H-O-8-W-H-O. Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Mikey.
Mikey who?
Mikey doesn't fit in the keyhole.
Time now for your Radio BVM news update. The Board of Trade met last Thursday at the Municipal Hall with Mr. Ferguson in the chair. Arrangements were made to commence a series of Wednesday afternoon trips to various parts of the district in order that the members may become better acquainted with outlying parts. Yesterday, Wednesday, the first trip was made to Messrs. Blodell, Stewart, and Welsh's Mill on the North Armet boundary. At the next meeting, the third Thursday in July, the subject of special discussion will be insurance, with special speakers on the subject. No meeting will be held during August. Residents are informed that arrangements have now been made for the collection of garbage. The council has selected a suitable site as a dump, and it is hoped that everyone will phone Glenn 355L as early as possible so that the contractor may commence regular collections. The members of the Happy Bunch Club met at the home of Mr. F.Y. Longs, 4115 Parker Street, last Saturday. Among the guests were Mr. and Mrs. E. Morgan, Grandview, Mrs. Nesbitt, Mr. Griffin and Mrs. C. Brown of Vancouver, Mrs. Campbell, Mrs. Soberly, Mr. and Mrs. Irwin, Mr. and Mrs. Cowie, Mr. J. Latham, Mr. and Mrs. Blaylock, Mr. and Mrs. Keltenbach. In the whist tournament, Mrs. J. Blaylock and Mr. W. Cowie won the first prizes in ladies and gentlemen respectively. Mrs. E. Morgan and Mr. F. Burchill won the booby prizes. Ice cream and coffee were served with the refreshments, while the music for dancing was provided by Mr. Keltenbach. Mr. D. Swadling was the floor manager. The members of the club are Mr. and Mrs. Long, Mr. and Mrs. Islay, Mr. and Mrs. Swadling, Mr. and Mrs. Franks, Mr. F. Burchill, and Mr. and Mrs. Sargent. And that was your Radio BVM news update.
This is Radio BVM, and we're here at Seaforth School with Mr. Demare. And can you tell us a bit about the Seaforth School?
Seaforth School, of course. Well, Seaforth School really is a heritage building. It's one of our original Burnaby schoolhouses, built in 1922 on the north side of Burnaby Lake, in an area which at that time was called Lozelles. And there's a modern-day Seaforth School there today as well. So Seaforth School was built because the parents in that area realized that they had quite a few school-aged children, and they were paying their taxes to the local school board, and they weren't getting any return for their money. So they asked the local municipal government if they could have a school built. And they had a good case because they did have the children. They didn't want to see their children walking long distances to the closest elementary school, which was still probably about an hour's walk away. There were still a lot of wild animals in Burnaby at that time, and sending kids to wander the woods when there were bears in the neighborhood, not a good idea. So money in the school district was diverted to build Seaforth School, and the local contractor built the school, and it opened its doors and began operation in 1922. They hired a teacher, what was her name again? Mrs. Postle was the first teacher. And even though she was a Mrs., we are under the impression that she was probably widowed, because usually married women were not teachers at that time. But Seaforth School was a one-room schoolhouse, And in the mid-1920s, one room meant 8 grades. So what we think of today as the modern grade system was just starting to take shape at that time. And what we think of as elementary school, the end date changed a little bit here and there. But it was basically age 14, or grades 1 through 8 at that time.
And what would the grade 1 age be around?
It's similar today. It's grade 6, or sorry, age 6 to age 14. And it sort of was starting at that time to coalesce into what we think of as the grades, as more or less as we know them today. So at that time, grade 8, 1 through 8, was considered an elementary schooling. And if you stayed in school for those 8 years, that was considered to be, about all the formal schooling most people needed. So once you left school in grade 8, then you were generally thought to have enough schooling. It was time to go out and make your way in the world, get a job, do whatever else you were going to do as a young adult. You can see too, if you look in Seaforth School, you see we have 4 rows of desks, and at the far side, the row of desks is quite small.
Yes, yeah, I see that.
And then as you look at the rows, you can see the desks get larger. So the idea, of course, is that as a youngster in grade 1, you would start on one side, and as you grew older, you would also physically grow larger, so you'd want a larger desk, and you'd be moved to the other side.
Now the desks have they're sharing the same board, and they have a different structure to them where the back of the desk is attached to the front. What can you tell us about that?
Well, there are a number of different designs of desks. So what you're noticing, of course, is that the desks are actually mounted to these wooden rails, so they can't be rearranged into different configurations. And some desks have seats that lift up, as ours do. Some desks had lids, desktops that lifted up. People who visit often think of those desks. And I don't know if there's any great significance behind that design feature. But what is important to note is the fact, though, that they are mounted to rails. So you have to put the desks in that row. And as you mentioned, the seats of the desk are mounted actually to the desk behind. So if you're not in that row, you won't have a good seat to sit on or a desk in front of you. So you have to put seats in that row. So that meant 2 things. It meant that the desks stuck together, so if you had to move them, you moved them as a separate unit. Often one-room schools, which were usually in a more rural area, were used as community halls as well, so it's very easy to move them aside and stack them up. But probably more importantly, it meant that the students had to sit in rows. They didn't make little pods or 4 desk seating areas, which we find today. And the basic idea in schools in those days was that students had to be fairly strongly controlled. If students are allowed to move about, they will potentially become restless. They may not actually stay in that grouping that you want, in the grade grouping. So it's a way of keeping the students physically constrained, forcing them to be in their row, forcing them to always look forward at the teacher, and preventing them from too much fooling around and sharing their desks, looking this way and that. So that was part of the ethos of the time. Schools were much more authoritarian. Students are supposed to look forward, pay attention, sit up straight, do what they were told. And that sort of atmosphere was very prevalent. Didn't mean students occasionally did not fool around, because they sometimes did. But by and large, students were asked to sit down, sit forward, sit up straight, do their work.
Right. Now, how would a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse teach all the different grades?
That's a very good question, and the answer is actually that there were a variety of teaching approaches. Ideally, a teacher who was well trained at one of the provincial normal schools would be able to work with different groups, and she would set the students up for different activities, different projects within their grade group. You'll notice that we have a lot of chalkboard space here on 3 of our walls.
3 walls, yeah.
3 walls, and they're almost completely covered with these blackboards.
Yeah.
And the idea, of course, was that the teacher would write different assignments, different tasks on the boards for the students. And a lot of the work that a student did in those days was called seat work, which meant you sat in your seat and you copied from the chalkboard. So a teacher who was fairly competent would be able to tell the different grade groups to copy certain sections from the board. Each set of exercises we have on the board is identified with the grade. So we have the grade 1 work, the grade 2 work, the grade 3 work. And a teacher would tell the different grades to copy this section from the board into your notebook and work on that. Well, the teacher then went on to a different group and maybe worked a little bit more directly. So you might have different little clusters of groups doing different tasks, and the teacher would move from one cluster to another to make sure they were on task or to make sure that they were, in fact, doing what they were supposed to do. It wasn't unknown either to have older students working with younger students. And that's part of a long, I'll say time-honored tradition, but there's some question about how honorable it was. In the English system in the early 1800s, someone devised a method called the monitorial method for dealing with large groups of students. And one teacher could run a class of 200 students by using that method. And it was a method of teachers using senior students to supervise other senior students who would supervise younger children. So there was this whole sort of classroom hierarchy. Yeah. And even by the 1920s, you would still find vestiges of that system in the public schools.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, there were also teachers in some schools who were not very competent. Even though by the 1920s, most school teachers had at least what we might think of as a grade 11 education and a term that would be 9 months in the normal school. That was pretty standard. Now, they were getting rid of the lowest level of teacher certification at that time. So teachers were getting increasingly better trained. But that having been said, not all teachers were as competent as it was desired, and some teachers tended to teach just to a middle level. And if students were really young and didn't understand what was happening, they would miss out. If students who were older or were quite bright found that the work was a little too easy or repetitive or was work they'd seen before, they might lose out as well. So you get a range of stories. Here in Seaforth School, though, the first teacher, Mrs. Postel, and the subsequent teacher, a Miss Pullinger, the stories we have from them are actually quite positive, that they were fairly competent and they got reasonably good reviews from the inspector, and they were reasonably well regarded by the teachers.
Was it common to have male teachers, or was it always female?
It was more common in an elementary school to have a female teacher. So when we think of the typical one-room schoolhouse teacher, it's typically a young woman who might be 18, 19, 20 years old, who has about a grade 11 education and has had the one term 9 months at normal school.
And what's normal school?
Normal school, now that's a good question. Normal school is with a capital N. And normal school, it comes from the French term for the teacher training college, but it was adopted throughout the West, Europe, as the teacher training school that teachers would attend.
Where was that?
Well, in BC, the first normal school was in Vancouver, 1901, I believe, and then by 15, Victoria also had a normal school. And in fact, you can go to the corner of, is it Cambie and Broadway? They have a shopping complex in there, and it's built around the original normal school. That's why there are old buildings as part of that shopping. I think they call it, anyway, I can't remember the name of the modern school, but that's part of the old normal school at that corner. And most teachers in the Burnaby area, Metro Vancouver, and a lot of the province were graduates from the Vancouver Normal School.
And I hear stories of teachers that were pretty strict or negligent. Mm-hmm. What kind of oversight would there be of teachers in one-room schoolhouses?
Well, in a one-room schoolhouse, now Burnaby was, or Seaforth was a one-room schoolhouse, but it wasn't quite as rural as they sometimes became. Yeah. So it was off the beaten path, but it wasn't way out in the middle of nowhere, if those metaphors are appropriate. Yeah. Typically, every schoolhouse was supposed to be visited once a year by an inspector. And BC was divided up into quite a few school districts. And in fact, there were a lot of school districts up until the Second World War. In fact, I think there were close to 800 school districts by the late 1930s. And there was a whole bureaucracy of inspectors. And the province was divided into a number of inspectorates, and every inspector who was in charge of an inspectorate was supposed to come to each school at least once a year. The reality was that some of those remote schools were sometimes missed, and we're talking about the really remote schools in BC. But the Burnaby schools were probably visited at least once a year by an inspector, and the inspector wrote a report and submitted it, and we can still look up the reports today and see, in general, what the inspector found of the school. And the inspector would have a look at the physical building to see if it was in good shape. And the inspector would often hide in the shadows and listen to the teacher teach a lesson or two. Or the inspector might be a bit more forthcoming and come right out and make his presence known. They were always men. I don't think there were ever any women inspectors. Sometimes the inspectors would also take the teacher aside and show her how to do something a little bit better or not. I don't know if that ever happened at Seaforth School. I suspect it did not, but that could happen. So chances are the teachers at Seaforth School in the 1920s had a visit from the inspector from time to time, and that was usually a reason to be on your best behavior, because inspectors could make or break your career. Now, inspectors also generally, at least this is the historical argument, generally wanted their schools to look good, because if you were the inspector of a good set of schools, chances are you would be promoted and you would move closer and closer to the desirable parts of the province to live in, such as Metro Vancouver or Victoria. The inspector up at the Peace River area probably didn't want to spend his entire career getting stuck in the mud looking at schools in the Peace River area.